Welcome to the Just Wanna Quilt podcast. My name is Elizabeth Townsend Guard. I'm the host. I'm a law professor and an avid quilter. These are episodes that we recorded throughout 2021 that we're releasing in December, and I hope that you enjoy them. So today we have on Marianne Fons, who is the coolest thing on the planet. You all probably know her, but she's super duper famous, really important in the industry, and we talk about all kinds of things. I hope you enjoy the interview.
Hi.
Hey. Hello.
I've been practicing with my video, my position on my computer the last few minutes. I'm up on Washington Island.
Oh, nice.
And can you see the hummingbird feeder over my shoulder?
I can, yes.
But there's sometimes 5 chicks drinking at one time.
Amazing.
We fed the parents back in the summer, and they drank the sugar water. And then we came back. It was the babies. They go through a bottle in 48 hours. So anyway, I thought it'd be neat that maybe you catch the babies back there.
Very cool. Well, thank you for meeting. I thought we'd just catch up. We're doing our interviews that are just kind of short interviews to see how people are doing that we've interviewed in the past, and just kind of checking in with everyone because it's been such a venture in crazy ways. If that works for you.
Yeah.
All right, cool. I know the answer to this, but for preservation purposes, can you tell me your name and where you're calling from?
This is Marianne Fons, and I'm calling in from Washington Island, Wisconsin, up in Door County on Lake Michigan.
Oh, very cool.
Yes.
So I'm, how are you doing, and how has this last year and a half been for you? Let's start there. And then we'll sort of move on to specific questions.
Well, for me, as a retired person, my life is quite different from when I was involved in the quilting industry, and I was traveling all over the country, lecturing and teaching, and, going through airports, and, it was pretty easy for me just to stay home during the previous worst of it. And my dog is going to bark. I'm going to let my dog in. My husband and I moved in October of last year from a traditional home that I had lived in for over 30 years, and my kids grew up in, and Mark and I'd lived together for 20 years. And we moved into a historic building just off the town square in Winterset. It's a 2-story brick building from, 1890 or so, that was transformed into a space that really feels like a apartment in Chicago or New York. And so that was very invigorating. And I can see the courthouse clock from my office in Madison County on Winterset. And I did all the things recommended. I wore my mask when I went in any place, and I didn't travel. And then in March, we got vaccinated, and there's a great sigh of relief, and my children got vaccinated, and
right.
I started doing things, feeling safe about things. And that seemed like that window closed pretty quickly. And so I'm feeling that everything is suddenly all complicated again. And it's a big topic, but anyway, one of the most exciting things I did recently was bring some Broadway performers from New York City. My oldest, Hannah's roommate, Dave Gary, we've known him for 20 years, as he went from off Broadway to becoming a permanent cast member in Phantom of the Opera. And so he brought other performers with him from New York mid-July, and sang three concerts actually at the Iowa Theater to raise money for the theater. And, people sat side by side, and it was just a fantastic experience. And the performers were, Broadway is dark, and so they were just thrilled to be on a stage again.
That's so nice.
So anyway, and I have done some quilting, although I don't have deadlines anymore. So, I pursue other things.
Now, before I get to the professional stuff, you've had one kid in New York, is that right? With one of your kids in New York, how did you handle that? And I know that Mary is in London now too. So how are you handling the mom side of the
Well, it's a good question because Hannah in New York, my oldest, she in March, she actually early on when things were so bad in New York, she did have COVID. And I actually had a dream, a kind of a nightmare one night because I'd read an article in the Times about, a woman taking care of her husband who was this robust, 40 something man, in an apartment in New York and how ill he was. And I was like, oh my God, Hannah, what if you are sick? Who will take care of you? And I talked to her the next day and she said, well, Dave would take care of me, her roommate, I would take care of him. And she later told me that she had COVID after she was well. So I'm sure, she's a great kid. She didn't want to worry me too much, but she had, I kind of joked because she told me she lost her sense of smell and she just felt terrible malaise. And I asked if she had a fever and she said, oh, I don't know. I don't have a thermometer. I'm like, yeah, why would two 40 something gay childless people have a thermometer in their apartment? There's no reason, and so she Dave was much sicker than she was, but I mean, I did, it was terrible. Yeah.
New York was so scary at the beginning. I mean, we were in New Orleans and because of Mardi Gras, we were like a mini New York. It was very bad here and very scary, but having friends and family in New York was just, it just felt like, I don't know, like you couldn't do anything and how terrifying. It felt like a war zone. And not being able to get,
constantly. And then last summer, about a year ago, Hannah drove from New York with a friend nonstop. They got tested, we got tested and came and visited me at the cottage. And, I've always have loved visiting New York and the vibe in New York and have visited Hannah 2 or 3 times a year for a long time. And, someday I hope to go back. I don't know when.
Don't know when. So odd.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all. Yeah. We've been in the house for, I don't know. Now we just live in the house. But Sid goes, my only, goes to Chicago for this in the fall. So we'll be heading up there shortly. So it'll be interesting to see, but in some way we feel like it's good to get out of the South. Like we're feeling very like nobody's so few are vaccinated here. And it just feels very dangerous to be in the South at the moment, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. There's a lot of beautiful things. My mother was from Mississippi and I grew up in Houston. So I have a feel for the South and there's a lot of beautiful things about it, but we're a complicated people.
Yeah, we are. All right. So I want to ask, these are short interviews, but I want to ask about, is it true that there's going to be a Fons and Porter exhibit at the Quilt Museum in October? Is that right?
Yes, in Lincoln. I don't have my calendar right here, but yes.
Tell me about that. Yeah.
Well, Liz and I were inducted into the Quilters Hall of Fame in 2019, and we put together a number of quilts to send over to Marion, Indiana that were on display then and then for a while after. And then the Iowa Quilt Museum, which I'm one of the founding board members of the Iowa Quilt Museum in Winterset, the exhibit committee decided that because of our induction into the Hall of Fame, that we would have a Fons and Porter exhibit in Winterset. And that was last fall. And, we have a gallery that holds 25 or so full-size quilts. And so the quilts looked just great there. And Liz came up to Winterset and we did some events and so forth. That was in 2019 before everything changed. And I'm not sure just how it came about, but Carolyn Ducey, of course, the Iowa Quilt Museum and the International Quilt Museum, both IQM, by the way. We use that acronym first, but anyway, we're good buddies, and Carolyn and the whole staff at the IQM Lincoln have been very helpful for the Iowa Quilt Museum. They helped us with our lighting. Our architect went over to Lincoln to check out everything there before the build out of the Iowa Quilt Museum. And I was on the advisory board there for a period of years, which was thrilling to me. And so I think Carolyn just suggested, I don't know just how it came up, but she said, we'd like to have that exhibit over here in Lincoln. And so the dates were set. It won't be the same quilts because Liz has made new quilts. I've made different quilts. I'm putting different quilts in, some of the same ones and so forth. And so do you want me to grab my calendar and tell you those dates?
Yeah, I think it's like October. I can take a look too. I think it starts in October if I'm
Yeah, through
remembering.
February, through
Right.
February, I believe.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so a super fun thing happened in July. Liz shipped her quilts from Austin, where she lives, but Carolyn drove over from Lincoln and picked up my quilts. It's about a 2.5 hour drive. And so we had lunch together, and I invited Megan Barrett, the director of the Iowa Quilt Museum, and our board chair, Randall Parkin. And so we broke bread together there in my new space in Winterset, and Carolyn drove the quilts over, and we saved the shipping and had a fun social time and all. So
I like that.
anyway,
That's really nice.
It's a terrific honor that those quilts are going to be on exhibit in, the premier quilt museum of the world.
Right. Yeah. Huge. Let me help me understand what the exhibit will be. Is it a retrospective? Is it your current? I mean, you talked about your current work. Like if someone's interested in going, what are they going to be seeing at that exhibit?
Well, it's not a retrospective really, because it's not something that we thought about going back to early quilts. I think it's called something like Fons and Porter Favorites or something like that. It's like, because Liz and I both have given away so many quilts over the years, and there's just some I just can't part with. And so I think we each have 8. But what's really fun is many people will remember the Quilter's Complete Guide, which is the Bible of quilt making that Liz and I wrote, published in 92 or 93, hardcover, and then soft cover. And it was in print for over 10 years, I believe. And then a couple of years ago, we were approached by Dover Publications, and they republished it. And they actually just did super high quality scans of the pages, because who knows, we couldn't find the files, of course. They would have been in Birmingham, Oxmoor House, which doesn't exist anymore there. And so they did a beautiful job of publishing it. And during that process, Dover went into bankruptcy. But the book is in print, and there are copies for sale at the Quilt Museum in Winterset, probably in Lincoln too. But the fun thing is that we had hung on to the manuscript for all these years. And the manuscript is in the largest binder, 3-ring binder known to man. It weighs 13 pounds. And because all the process photos that were included in the book, we took photos and stapled them. This is back in the time of actual film. And we stapled them to the pages of the manuscript so that Oxmoor House, the publisher, could retake the photos with a hand model in a studio. And we also had made all the step outs that were needed for these process photos. And so I asked the museum if they wanted them. And they said they have the manuscript, they have one of the sampler quilts, they have all the step outs. And I even recently gave them the Bernina sewing machine that I used to sew some of the parts. And so I think they're going to display that ephemera there, which hasn't ever been displayed. But I remember when we gave that stuff to the museum, I go to Lincoln as often as I can to see the exhibits. And there was an intern there whose job it was to catalog all of these things. And there were, zillions of little things that they had to catalog. That's the way they are. They catalog, everything's got a number. So it'll be fun to see that because we spent 3 years on that manuscript. Yeah.
That's really great. I love it. It's really cool. Let me ask you another question. So one of the things we got into a project accidentally. We started to look at good project, but it's a challenging one for me, I guess. So just to remind you, I'm a law professor, but I'm also a cultural historian. And my first training was in cultural history. And so this was a weird project that's so we were trying to figure out how to do books. So we got our books that are IP books. So just want to trademark, just want all of that. But we were trying to figure out how to get people to understand copyright, kind of like, when you hide the vegetables in the cake, like how do you get to understand copyright without actually knowing copyright? So we started to do a book called Just Want a Medallion. And it was looking at medallions were great because they're often just very traditional blocks. The math matters, but it's very easy. And we kept hitting upon this quilt, which is, three of them, the Martha Washington quilts. So she did 3 medallion quilts that were Martha Washington quilts. And we were like, oh, that's great. Just want a Martha, right? So we were being very funny about it. And it's a very simple quilt and it goes together really fast. We thought that's great. That's a great example. And so we started having people make their own version so we could do stuff about spectrum of infringement, right? When is something an idea? When is something, your own thing, right? So it was a really great project. And then we hit Martha as a person, which was slave owner, never gave up on the idea that was a good thing. All those things started happening. And I'm a California transplant to the South. So it suddenly sort of struck me of how many Southern quilts have this problem. And we kind of sort of started to lean into this quilt allowed us to understand many, many things. But I was curious about sort of your relationship or your thought about history. There's the context, the history. And then there's the quilt history, which is, why did they make it or any of those things. And now the project's kind of stuck, right? Because we're like, well, are we glorifying slavery? Are we not? What do we do with this? Martha's an overlooked character. So many women are. So the whole thing we've spent a lot of time on this project and I'm kind of stuck. So I thought I'd be curious about your thoughts about all. That's a lot to throw at you, but kind of, I don't know, just kind of your musings about sort of history and quilting and the role of history and all that. So.
Can you put that into a question?
Yeah, I can do that. So how important is it to understand our quilt history? Do you feel quilt history is an important component of quilting? Let's start there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the problems is with all women's history and domestic history, not much is recorded, it's hard to find. I've always understood, the number of actual diaries where women talked about anything other than just their list, the things they did that day,
right,
are really available. And so, as we look at original sources and try to piece together, pun intended, what really happened and how things really were, I think it's very, very difficult. I've always thought, I always use the example. Every article that's ever been published about me in a newspaper when I was visiting somewhere has full of errors, unless I wrote it myself. And then I suppose, there's my own human errors. So, right. We rely on these sources to say, well, this is how it was, when they're flawed, they're written by people and they're inaccurate. Right. So there's that. And, in terms of, well, not just slavery, but slave made or enslaved people quilts. I always think back to a lecture that Barbara Brackman gave in Williamsburg, Virginia, at a conference I was also a presenter at long ago. And of course, I think of Barbara as,
she's
really just about the top historian.
Right. She's the it. That's right. She's the it girl. Cause
yes.
Yeah. We wouldn't be who we were without Barbara. And that's still the case.
Exactly.
Her careful documenting of blocks changed the nature of how we think about quilting in such a profound way.
Exactly.
I think.
Exactly. And her delving into lots of things. The point that she was making is that the quilts that enslaved women made were really not much different than the quilts that the non-enslaved women made, because fashion is fashion. And she showed pictures of white women and of Black women at the same time period, and their dresses were almost the same. Yes, some were finer fabric. The fabrics might have been different, but the styles were the same. And so her point was that the style of a quilt made by an enslaved person, that you cannot know who made a quilt. You absolutely cannot know whether it was made in and I hope, I'm trying to be political, to be
right.
sensitive.
Respectful,
but the big house, the quilt made in the big house and the quilt made out back might have been the exact same pattern. Women sewed everything. They might have worked on the same quilts. And that, this conference was kind of focused on fashion, on clothing. And she was, it just, the point really stuck with me was that, like, the quilt styles, what's popular, when the mini dress is popular, everyone's wearing the mini dress. When bell bottoms are popular, everyone's wearing bell bottoms. And so if the Mariner's Compass is popular, everybody's making it. And so that's one of the thoughts, the meditations I have on that. And Martha Washington, I don't know much about Martha, although I have a hilarious photo I could send you that I used in a lecture that I did called Why We Quilt. And I showed a picture of one of Martha Washington's tops that was unfinished at her death, and how her niece or someone, I'm forgetting the details now.
Right. Yes, that's right.
A couple of dollars. And then I next show this picture of a woman at a long arm machine with Martha Washington's face superimposed on it, that if she had a long arm, she would have finished her quilt. So
totally.
Kind of funny. It was funny. So I don't know what her attitudes were on slavery, but I think we have to recognize the fact that people are of their time.
Right.
And a lot of the attitudes of our time are attitudes of our time. And we can't, and I know the word woke is thrown around negatively and positively, but it's a lot to expect people to be woke like someone else, who has more information and more understanding of what happens to people when other people are in power over them day in and day out.
That's, I think it's so interesting. I feel like this quilt allows us to, this one quilt lets us in on a lot of levels. And so, I'm not sure where the project will end or what it will be, but let me ask you another question related to this. What role do you think that quilt museums play in our world? I'll just stop there, because why do we have quilt museums, and what role do they play in our world?
Well, we have museums, period, to preserve the past. Quilt museums preserve soft, fragile fabric items. And we have museums because there are people that believe it's important, that quilts are important, and quilts are important to American culture. And we know that although quilts and quilting have existed everywhere in the world for a very long time, nowhere did what happened to quilts happen the way it did in the United States. It was a perfect storm of fabric and sewing skill and time and design. And so, yes, it's quilt museums. When I started quilting around the bicentennial, way back in 1976, I don't think there probably was a quilt museum anywhere. There were museums that had quilts in their collections, but there were no museums dedicated to quilts. And it's been pretty cool. And when the Quilt Museum opened in Lincoln, I was there because I'd been invited to be on the board, or was going to, and I remember just crying kind of inwardly with joy that I lived long enough, to see something like this, all this, it had a famous architect, and, the academic nature of the association of the museum with the University of Nebraska is just, my soul was just bursting with pride and joy about that. So yes, that's why quilt museums need to exist. And the fact that there are a number of them means that we value quilts and think that they're important enough to save. But my own, I've analyzed my own interest in quilts from the past. And I'm a member of the American Quilt Study Group, and I've been hanging around with women sometime, mostly women, who are examining every signature on a signature quilt and finding who the family members and all this. Right. And what I really care about, those quilts, for me, it's design. It's a design that what works, what makes this quilt work. And that's why looking at a quilt on a wall of a museum or in a photograph tells me almost more about the design quality than looking at it with a magnifying glass and at the fabric and stuff, because I'm just so attracted to broad strokes in terms of design.
Yeah.
Father was a commercial artist, and I was an embroiderer before I found out about quilts. And what really grabbed me was, the large format of a quilt in terms of design. So anyway.
It's very interesting. All right, 2 more questions related to that. So when you look at a quilt, when you look at a historical quilt or any kind of quilt, do you have a particular process? I mean, so funny, like when you're like a professional, you do all these things really fast and like it's intuitive, right? But for us that are like going to a museum and looking at a quilt, can you help us understand sort of your process of what we should be thinking about when we see quilts in a museum? Does that make sense?
Yes. And of course, the reason I always look at quilts the reason I look at antique quilts, and I did throughout my career, was they were in the public domain. And because I was making a living as a quilter, it was very important that I go to a design source that was not a copyright infringement. And so luckily for me, the 19th century is jam-packed with fantastic designs, also not fantastic designs, and great workmanship and not great workmanship. It is just, the body of work there is it's just a gold mine of copyright-free motifs and so forth. So I always look at quilts. I'm always looking for something that grabs me from a design standpoint. And then I look at it, and this is one of the most fun things, is how could I make that? How would I make that? How did she make that? And so Fons and Porter, I mean, what we did was make good looking quilts that anyone could make using today's techniques. And so, we grabbed design from the past and modernized it in a way, not modern like the Modern Quilt Guild, but contemporized it, I guess. So I'm always, and I mean, the quilts that I can't part with, like a couple of them that are going to be in Lincoln, one of them is American Pie, another one is Flower Bed. And those are quilts. And when I saw them, I'm like, oh my God, how in the did this person make this quilt? How? I mean, there's a 9 patch. Flower Bed is this 9 patch, and it makes these circles. And all she did was take a 9 patch and sew a strip on one side and then turn it. And so I wound up making this very large square king size quilt by making 4 identical quadrants, a center block put together with partial seaming, and then these 4 giant quadrants were attached with a partial seam. And I'm like, and then American Pie is, oh my God, it's like, how did she do this? How can I do this? And if Jean Nolte at Fons and Porter hadn't drawn me a diagram in Illustrator, I never would have been able to do it. And I was so sick of it when I finished it, because it's just the same thing over and over and over. These wedges. That's why it's American Pie. It's these wedges. So yeah, that's what it is. I guess I'm intrigued by the genius of the person that not only did something technically clever, but that worked graphically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the joy of the quilting in some way. And my copyright hat on is, that sort of, how did they do that? The construction, the parts that go together, if the design itself's in the public domain, how do you make it your own? It's just a conversation about, as you said, structure and beauty and construction.
Engineering.
I mean, it's amazing how many quilters have engineering backgrounds at this point that they gravitate to it. It's kind of remarkable. It's very interesting.
Mary and I did a lecture. We did a program together for a number of years called, I think it was Everyday Quilts, Extraordinary Quilters or something. Anyway, but we chose the quilts based on 3 engineering, risk, and personality. Those were how we picked the quilts, that they grabbed us for one of those reasons. So we did a whole thing about, the women that made these quilts that we showed would today be, computer programmers or NASA engineers or, mathematicians, that they had the kind of brain that was attracted to this kind of thing.
Complicated. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really
But they had no
remarkable.
opportunity to really pursue that.
Yeah. Well, as a part of our Martha Quilt experiences, which we still don't know what this project is, we suddenly realized we were coming up on the 250th anniversary of the country, so 2026. And that made us think about 1976. And so that became part of our kind of conversations as we're sort of trying to figure out what this project is, which is who are we now as we reach this 50th anniversary that we weren't, because it's already starting, right? So some of the the exhibit and, the Whitney, like all of it sort of, it didn't happen like 1976, suddenly quilting happened, right? It was happening before that. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, because you are it, right? Like you and Liz, like, I mean, the whole thing is like it's really important. You're a super important person and important to the story. And I'm curious as we get to that 2026, what your thoughts are. And have you thought about 2026 and that 50th anniversary of the renaissance of quilting?
No, I haven't, because back in 2020, when I think I saw you last at QuiltCon,
right?
Mary and I did this lecture called, I think it was called, 50 years since the Big Bang,
right.
The Big Bang of the Whitney and
right.
The bicentennial, and what was the other element and so we did kind of reminisce and talk about that. And I guess one of the things that I feel so grateful that I was around and got started quilting with the bicentennial, Liz and I were a good 5 years younger than most of the people that became prominent. And that was really great, because we had these women that we looked up to, like Jean Ray Laurie and Virginia Avery. And, we had some fantastic role models there. But the thing that it impresses me a lot when I think back is that because of the Big Bang with the quilting resurgence and interest, it enabled me to make a living. It enabled people to make a living or to make part of a living in an industry that really hadn't exactly existed before. And so, you had Marty Michelle and people starting publishing companies and product development and so forth. And I mean, that's just pretty awesome. And, that book I was talking about, The Complete Guide, I mean, the royalties that I earned twice a year, Liz and I split them half and half. I mean, a lot of us just went to the University of Iowa because that's where my children, all three of them, were educated. And so, it enabled me to educate the women that, that I bore.
It's really awesome. I mean, that's just like, I get that. I do. I personally understand that. There's something about that. It's really empowering to be able to do that for your kids, and sort of that independence that makes that. I feel like at this point, the industry is interesting. And I'm curious if you felt that way at the time. It felt like you were incredibly creative and entrepreneurial and business savvy, and you learned along the way and you grabbed opportunities. It feels like a little bit like the market is saturated at the moment because of sort of the nature of anyone can start an Etsy shop. And that sometimes I feel like the industry is very still kind of, maybe it's opportunity for women, but a little bit exploitative of women in sort of the nature. It's very hard to make a living with quilting. And there's a lot going on. And there's a lot of kind of, it's almost like the acting world. There's kind of a kind of fakeness of like, oh, well, maybe I'll be able to make my living with this. And most people can't. And most people don't. And I'm curious if that's a new thing, or is that happening when you started as well?
Well, when we started, I mean, all we wanted to do was make money. We needed money. We had little kids. We both had husbands that weren't that productive, and we, we needed diapers and milk and so forth. And we just were highly motivated and very smart and energetic and skilled and talented. And so we just constantly look for another revenue stream. And I remember different times during my career when it's like, oh my God, this publisher publishes a book a week. They're competing, they're how can anybody make any money on a book if there's another one coming out every other day? Right. And so, and as far as the quilting industry right now, I mean, I'll throw an anecdote in there that the bus tours of quilters that are returning to Winterset, I don't know if that'll keep up, but a month or so ago, I was scheduled to do a little trunk show at the restaurant where a busload of like 50 quilters were going to have lunch, and I think they pay the museum $100 and I come and do a show and tell. And I was walking down out of the yoga class that morning with a friend who's also a quilter. And I said, yeah, I'm going to talk to these quilters at lunchtime. And I just don't know that I'm really relevant anymore. I just don't feel very relevant. And Jerry said, oh, I think you'll be fine. And so when I took my quilts over and I talked to these, and I hadn't been around quilters, since QuiltCon, and I'm not out there and so forth. I'm not a business owner. And of course, so I related that to the audience. I said, I don't feel very relevant. Well, they all clapped. Oh yeah, we love you. And so the thing is, it showed me it's like, I mean, I used to know who owned every company in the quilt world because I sold advertising and I knew all the trends. I knew who were the A-list quilters and who was on the circuit and who had something to say and all this and the people I admired, my mentors and so forth. I don't know anything about any of that anymore. I mean, I have no idea. I haven't been to Quilt Market and I don't know. And I wouldn't,
well, and it's getting so fractured. I mean, Quilt Market, will it go this year? We don't even know. You know what I mean? Like that, it'll be interesting to see what happens when there's not a centralized space for an industry. How do you know? Right.
Yeah. Like that, if I picture myself going to Quilt Market, if the world were normal, I think people say, oh my God, that's Marianne Fons. I thought she was dead. She's still alive.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't care. I really don't care because it was a great ride. And, the fact that our quilts are being displayed in Lincoln is fantastic. And we've had quilts on display in Paducah before. That show was, called 25 quilts from 25 years of Fons and Porter. And that was like 20 years ago. So the quilts that are going to be in Lincoln are different quilts, because we've made so many quilts. But the thing is, like, and I could show you, this is not going to be a video thing, right? What we're doing, it's a conversation. But I could send you a picture of here in Washington, Iowa, and they have what Mary named it the little boathouse, and that's the sewing studio here. And there's a chalkboard wall that since 2014, I've recorded every quilt that I've worked on here. It's like as a box to check off, and mini quilts of valor and all this. Even Mary worked on a quilt here, and I'm pursuing fiction writing. Right. I've written one novel. I'm working on another one, and so
I've read one. I've read one of yours. It was great.
My Life with Shelley, and I got an agent. I got an agent, but then she loved my book, and she thought we'd get a 2-book deal, and she couldn't find a publisher interested in it. And so I'm working on a novel called Winterset now, and it's set in the 1950s. Anyway, so I erased the chalkboard. It was full, and I took a video of it before I erased it and washed it all down. And now I'm plotting my novel.
That's nice.
My novel is 2/3 of the way done. I mean, but I'm outlining and doing things.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like, I put my sewing machine in its case, and I stowed my ironing board, and it was kind of symbolic for me. And, I always just loved literature and writing so much, and I needed to make a living, and, here was quilting. And so I wrote how-to books, sew piece A to piece B, press the seams. This is not a plot.
Yeah. Right.
And it was writing, but, so I'm writing different things now and making friends in the writing world, and, have writing friends as well as quilting friends. And who knows if I'll make it. But, I guess I hadn't thought of it till now, but, our mission statement for Fons and Porter, and what Liz and I wanted to do, in addition to make a living, we always said we want quilting to be as much fun for you as it is for us. And I guess as a writer, I just want to give people a good read.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah. I love it. And there's something about, I'm in a room, it looks very empty, but it's got dry erase paint on it. And so we map out everything. And there's something about putting it on a big board and a big wall that really, I don't know, it just changes it all. And so in such an interesting way. Well, I can't wait. I am on your list of readers because I liked the first one so much. And so we have to, I really did. So I would love to, I just think it's so cool. Do you feel like with writing, so with the quilting, there was always the impetus of having to make money. And I feel like I'm there. I'm so full professor, almost empty nester. I don't have obligations in the same way I did. I'm not retired, but it's kind of weird. It's like sort of retired, right? Like there's not the same kind of pressure. There's not the anxiety of like, I got to get to every conference. I got to, you know what I mean? Like there's like, the kind of,
you don't have the same push.
No. So you think, well, what's the push now? And I'm curious about the writing, how you approach that. How is that different? How is that different than the quilting career, the writing career? Because it feels like it's got a different motivation behind it. It's, you know what I mean? Like there's and sort of how do you think about that?
No. The thing is, I'm kind of goal oriented and so, I say, and my daughter, Mary, who's great at asking deep questions, is throughout the writing of my life with Shelley, my first book, she's like, why are you doing this, Mom? Why are you doing this? And so I had to answer her. And of course, you always do things for more than one reason. And so, of course, one reason is to give people a good read. I'm a writer of like book club fiction with a literary bent. And so I'd like to give people a good read. I'd like to prove that I can do it, which I did already once. And so I'm proving that I can do it. I have and also it's all because of an idea. I had an idea for My Life with Shelley, and I had an idea that intrigued me for Winterset. And cool thing about Winterset is I'm going to get to write about fashion because I love fashion, the fashion
really cool.
Of the 50s and 60s. But so I want to give people a good read. I want to prove I can do it. And I also, if I just wanted to write a novel and publish it, I could publish it myself, but I wouldn't do that at all because I want the legitimacy of, an agent and a publisher, even though, it's as hard to get a novel published as like making a living in the quilt world. I mean, very, very, very few people do. The fact that I got an agent is amazing.
Right. It's amazing. Yeah. It is a big moment. Yeah.
It's really hard. Right?
Totally.
Months,
very difficult.
Very difficult.
It's legitimizing. I mean, it means that you're a serious writer that they're willing to take a chance. Like I mean, it's a moment. It's an accomplishment in itself.
It's a threshold. It's a crossroads, whatever you want to call it. And of course, last year I was in a year-long class called Novel in a Year through Story Studio Chicago. And my teacher is Rebecca Mackay, who wrote The Great Believers, it was one of the New York Times 10 best books of the 2018, I think it was. And I'm in a class now with her called The Long Haul, which is to finish writing. But the Novel in a Year class, you had to submit 20 pages to get in the class. So the 12 of us in our cohort were all really good writers. And it was something very important about that. And she said, look, kids, she's like, right. I think like 55 people or 70 people, applied, and the 12 of us got in. So like, okay, she says, don't apologize, for anything. So I guess as a lover of literature and lover of a really good story, I want to craft that myself. I'm motivated by what I think is a good idea in terms of plot and story. The book I'm writing, I didn't set out to do this, but I was actually in a gong yoga class summer before last in Washington Island. And while these women were playing these gongs and putting us to these poses, somehow I started thinking about the 7 deadly sins and trying to think of all 7 of these sins for some reason, and realizing that my characters in the book I'm writing, they have, each of them represents 1 or 2 of these sins, several of the major ones. We have the man who is pride and lust are motivators for him. And we have the shop owner who loves money so she's avarice, and then we have the cuckolded husband who is wrathful. So, it's like stuff like that just gets me going.
I like that. I like that a lot.
And so, the readers won't know that. I mean, that's just, I know that.
Right. Well, my dissertation chair said, like, it's like mountain, like you see the little tip of it, but there's so much there. And that's what makes a great work is all the work that you don't see. And that, you just see a tip of it. It all just seems normal and natural, but you've done a ton of work to get there.
You may have written a 20-page backstory of the life of one of your characters that never gets into the book. It's just like, you need to know this.
That's right.
The reader may not need to know it, but you need to know it.
Yeah, exactly. They're right. And then it feels full and real. And the audience doesn't understand why that is, but that's because they are doing what they're supposed to do as a character, which is really interesting. Exactly. Last question. How important is community with writing? Because you've talked about the course that the studio, and you always think of writing as solitary. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, it is solitary. And I up here at the cottage alone with me and the dog for a month to work on my manuscript because I was busy doing so many. I paused. With my life with Shelley, I never paused more than a day. And this, I've had long pauses, and you stop living in the story then. So I'm like re-entering the story. And I thought it would go fast, but it's, I'm back on page 24. Deciding that there needs to be a rose bush at the end of the porch, in the story. So it's solitary, but I mean, I really enjoy my writing friends, and the cohort in Novel in a Year that we had to stop meeting in person in March after having met in person every month since August. And we went to virtual like everything. But in that sweet spot, mid-July, Randy Romano, one of our cohort, had a party in Chicago, and I took the train in, and most of us came. It was just wonderful to see him again. And, it's like any class. I mean, there's certain ones that you just gravitate toward and they become your friends, and we read each other's work. It's really writers these days. Well, I mean, gosh, think back to Hemingway and Fitzgerald, they were all Dos Passos, they all hung around together, drank together. And so I find the community of writing friends I've made not that different from the quilting community of not quilters as much as the professionals, And I gotten involved in the independent film movie theater community with my youngest Rebecca because of renovating the Iowa Theater, and that was a great group too, going to the annual meeting of those people. They were kind of like Quilt Market, they're just great people that love this particular thing. Now, if, when a member of my cohort or one of my writing friends gets published before I do, then, and it's someone you've, helped them and encouraged them and read their book and loved their book. Yeah. And I've actually introduced, connected one of my writing friends with my agent who read this friend's novel, which I really liked. It wasn't a good fit for her, but maybe the best way to conclude is that my agent said, when I was talking to her about a writing friend who had written a cozy mystery that I thought was really good, and would my agent look at it? And she said, sure. She said to me, "You're a good literary citizen."
Yes. Well, I mean, that's so because you were looking out for others and not just self-involved, right?
Yeah. Even though you might be jealous a little bit or envious or, just a little, I wanted that too. It's like, you can't massage that. You have to think, look, this is a worthy work. It's going to sell. It's a business. It's a market, good on you.
And it seems like a good, and this is a good sort of place to stop, but I think it feels like any good community, as you said, filmmakers, quilters, writers, there is a balance between the quiet month in a cabin by yourself and the community that is also doing that. And that the coming together is because you're all in that skill set doing that. I know that my kid is a creative writer. And so they have a partner that they chat with all the time, and they read each other and they're encouraging, and that's a really important thing. And I think that's part of being an artist, whatever kind of artist you are, if you're really like immersed, and that's very different than other things. So, I mean, I think it's really, it's this really interesting thing that sort of across whatever the field is, that's part of that. So it's exciting that you have that.
And I think it's also what you're saying makes me think of the fact that all three of my children, like me, really, really need to be alone, part of the time and with people
Yeah.
part of the time.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are people who want to be alone all the time or with people all the time. And I think it shows a balance that, you have this contemplative, hardworking part, but you also want to hang out with other people and talk about things you care about, like we're doing now about quilts and everything.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting that I think it gives, this conversation, I'm still thinking about the conversation. As we're having it of I need space to write, do a lot of writing. And so I need space to write. And that quiet space. And it's always been we tried when Sid was little, Ron would keep her up as late as possible so that I could have time to write in the morning, which was quite lovely. So, our kid didn't go to bed till 2 a.m. because that meant she'd sleep in till 11.
Totally get it.
So, but that is interesting, that balance of quiet, but also community that also recognizes the need for their own sort of the artist, what it means to be an artist, whatever that means, whatever kind of artwork well, this has been, we did not go a half hour because, it's impossible. But thank you so much for all of this conversation, and so nice to check in with you and see how you're doing and
make me feel relevant. Thanks for making me feel relevant.
Oh my gosh, you're so relevant. You're it. Seriously, seriously. Oh my gosh, not even a little bit unrelevant. Seriously. I see you as the most amazing entrepreneur on the planet. Just sort of what you did and built, and sort of, that it's just remarkable. I think that for me, it's always sort of amazed me, and we've had those conversations and they're incredible, but you're amazing and you're so nice and kind.
We were lucky to be in the right place at the right time. That's the deal, and have a lot of moxie. So have a wonderful day. Wonderful to see you. When we did. All right,
hold on just a second. Let me just, you okay with us posting? You need to review? You're okay. That's the legal side.
No, you can, I didn't say
anything.
All right,
hold on just a second.
I regret nothing.
You regret nothing.
So that was our interview with Marianne Fons. If you get a chance, take a look at the Fons and Porter exhibit. It's online at the International Quilt Museum, and also it's there until February of 2022. Also, if you want to play with us more, come to our Facebook group. We have more conversations about all kinds of things. We're also sometimes on TikTok, sometimes on Instagram. And of course, we hope you get a chance to quilt today. And here's the new music to end the show.